Hey, what's going on, everybody? From Nautilus, I'm Brian Gallagher, and you're watching Behind the Scenes. Today I'm speaking with Lucy Cooke. Lucy is a documentary filmmaker and broadcaster and a New York Times bestselling author. She holds a master's degree in zoology from Oxford University, where she was taught by Richard Dawkins. She has presented, directed, and produced many documentaries for the BBC on animal behavior, and in 2018 she gave a TED Talk on the strange life of the sloth. She is also the author of Bitch on the Female of the Species, her latest book. And in this conversation, that's what we're talking about. Lucy talked about her experience being pinned down in the Serengeti by a female lion looking to mate. She talked about Darwin's theory of sexual selection and how it enshrined the cultural biases of his time in Victorian England. We also talked about sex a lot: duck sex, dolphin sex, spider sex, as well as same-sex GG rubbing among bonobos. Lucy explained why sex didn't evolve for just reproduction, which she calls another real Victorian idea. She also talked about what it might mean for humanity that bonobos were able to, quote, overthrow the patriarchy through ecstatic sex, and other topics. It was great to be able to have Lucy on the show. Her book, Bitch, is an entertaining and erudite corrective to years of research bias against the idea of female agency and evolution and the study of female sexual anatomy. And now I bring you Lucy Cooke. I am here with Lucy Cooke. Lucy, thanks so much for joining us.
Oh, it's my pleasure. Thanks for having me, Brian.
So I will have introduced you in the opening segment, but for our viewers, could you say a little bit about yourself and how you think of what you're doing as an author and as a zoologist?
So I studied zoology at Oxford about quite a long time ago. In the late 1980s, I was taught by Richard Dawkins. And I specialised in animal behaviour and evolution. And then I went on to become a documentary filmmaker. And then the last 5 years or so, I've been primarily a writer. And my latest book, Bitch, tackles my favourite subject at university, which was sexual selection.
Fantastic. So what were some of the documentary films you worked on? Were they also on the subject of evolution and biology?
No, they weren't. No, I've had a very eclectic career. I started out in comedy, British comedy, and then I moved to making documentaries. I made really sort of history and social history documentaries, and I made some natural history in the sort of the later half of my TV career. Yeah, I primarily as a host and producer.
Interesting. So in your book, you write that much of what I had been taught as gospel at university, the very foundations of evolutionary biology, had been distorted by prejudice, was a shocking revelation. So when and how did this revelation dawn on you?
Well, I was actually making a documentary at the time about animal communication for the BBC, and I was in the Serengeti, and I was trying to have a conversation with a lion, which is actually possible. So what you need a loudspeaker and a lion communication expert, both of which I had in the Jeep. And so we played the sound of a lion's roar in another lion's territory, and we attracted a couple of 3 lions, in fact, padded out of the gloom to come and check us out. And 2 of them were males and 1 female. The 2 males disappeared when they saw there was nothing that resembled a rival. But the female lion pinned us to the spot, legs akimbo, and we were stuck for 2 hours. And I asked the lion expert that I was with what was going on, and he said, "Oh, she wants to mate with us." And I was like, "But surely she's mating with one of those males there." And he's like, yeah. The female lion, she's incredibly promiscuous, and she'll mate, up to 100 times with multiple males during her fertile period. And this blew my mind. I couldn't believe it, because at university, I was taught that according to zoological law, females were were seeking chastity, that it was males who were the promiscuous ones, and females were choosy and chaste. And that idea dates all the way back to Darwin and his theory of sexual selection. And so I was thrilled, and I'm going to say quite delighted by the licentious promiscuity of the lioness.
That is fascinating. So let's dive in a little bit. What is the idea of sexual selection, and what was Darwin trying to explain with that?
So Darwin's theory of sexual selection was really his sort of follow-up to natural selection. And he published the Descent of Man and Selection with Relation to Sex in 1871, or sort of 20 years after On the Origin of Species. And in it, he wanted to explain the differences between the sexes, but in particular, certain traits that were extremely extravagant, which he felt couldn't be explained by natural selection. Which is, the simple struggle for survival couldn't explain the flamboyance of the peacock's tail, for example, because the peacock's tail, it prevents the peacock from flying away from danger. It can't hide. Surely this is a hindrance in the case of survival. And he actually said he wrote a letter to one of his many sounding boards, where he said, "It used to be once upon a time the sight of an eye would make me sick. Now it's a peacock's feather makes me feel sick." Because but he came up with this idea of sexual selection, which is that there is another selection force, which is not about the simple struggle for survival, but the struggle for sex. And he saw that sexual selection was accounted for these extravagant traits, whether they were ornaments like the peacock's tail or armaments like the horns of a stag. And they were created by two forces: male competition and female choice. And this he published this in 1871, and within that book as well, he also use sexual selection to explain the differences in humans and the sort of superiority of man. So his theory of sexual selection was infused with the chauvinism of the period, unfortunately, which was very surprising to me, because Darwin's my hero. He's the reason why I studied evolution, and he is an extraordinary, meticulous scientist. And I think it's fascinating that someone who is as cautious and thorough and methodical as Darwin is also not immune to cultural bias.
Yeah, I've always been fascinated with evolution too. It was one of my favorite subjects in college. And I've always kind of wondered whether he was trying to, maybe part of him was trying to avoid controversy with the follow-up of sexual selection, because natural selection was so radical. It challenged religion and ideas of creation, where we all came from. And that was very unorthodox. But then sexual selection seems to enshrine all of the cultural biases that he was kind of challenging before. But now sexual selection upholds kind of the Victorian values about men and women. Is that how you see it?
Well, I think, this is a fantastic, fascinating discussion to have, and one that I really enjoy, because, it is all conjecture really at this stage. But, there are sorts of clues, aren't there, in his other writings. So his two big published books, On the Origin of Species and The Descent of Man, they are a lot more conservative than, say, his more obscure monographs on barnacles. And so, it's difficult to work out, isn't it, is how sort of liberal he was. What was his thinking? Did he really believe that females were inferior to males and that males were the dominant drivers of evolutionary change? Well, I think he did believe in his theory of sexual selection that it was driven by male competition and female choice. And he gave females agency by suggesting that female choice could shape the evolution of males. And that went down like a lead balloon in Victorian England. So he wasn't sort of, he that in that way he did, give females agency. But I also wonder how much, his daughter Henrietta edited the book, and she was famously prudish. So how much she sort of constrained his writing, we don't know. But I mean, I agree with you. I think the man had suffered, to anger the church and suggest that humans had evolved from primates. There's probably enough controversy in one lifetime. He might not have been striving for sexual equality in the wake of that. So maybe it influenced him. It's hard to tell. I mean, I
Right.
like to think that Darwin was more liberal than because he's such an amazing scientist. It's shocking to me that he could have been tripped up so badly by cultural bias.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And there's also a difference between the public Darwin and the private Darwin, because you discuss some of his private writings that he never published openly, and he seemed to be more willing to acknowledge the flexibility and plasticity of sex than in his public writings, right? Is that correct?
Yeah, when he writes about barnacles, he's on the money. Like he recognizes that, what you can see with some of the barnacles that he's studying, where you have a hermaphrodite with these barely formed males attached, and he recognizes that this is perhaps the evolution of single, hermaphrodite into separate sexed species. And when he writes to, I think it's Hooker, that the letter that he sends, that he writes to in that instance, he says, you will think to me the devil, me and my theory, the devil itself, for suggesting that such things were possible. But whether that's, on the one hand, you have that in his private writing, but then on the other hand, you also have his deliberations about whether he should get married or not, which were sort of scribbled down, this extraordinary pros and cons of marriage list, where he sort of worries that he's going to miss the company of clever men at clubs and be banished to the countryside, and but a nice soft wife on the sofa is better than a dog anyhow. To me,
Wow.
suggests that maybe Darwin wasn't perhaps driven by carnal urges, and he was more of a cerebral character, and maybe he wasn't terribly interested in females, as some super intelligent men that are more interested in intellectual things are, so it's hard to tell, isn't it? But it's interesting to speculate. It's certainly fun to speculate, but whether we'll ever know the truth.
So, what was the impetus to write this book, Bitch on the Female of the Species Now? What are some of the new findings and kind of revolutionary upendings of prior thought that are happening that you want to share with everyone?
Well, I mean, we're living in a time where being female has never been more scrutinized or politicized. And I feel that, there's been a revolution in our understanding of what it means to be female. And that revolution actually started in the early 1980s with the likes of Sarah Blaffer Hrdy and Patricia Goarty, and, first challenging these stereotypes that Darwin had set in stone of the passive female that's chaste, submissive, and coy. But even though they started those challenges, and in many cases won them in as early as the 1980s, much of that thinking has taken a long time to permeate into popular culture, certainly, but even into science. I mean, Patricia Goarty, who's been questioning these stereotypes for 30 odd years now, has taken to task Bateman's study, basically, which underpins these stereotypes, which was a fruit fly experiment, happened in the 1940s. It provided empirical evidence for the fact that females have nothing to gain by mating with multiple males, whereas males have everything to gain. And this is part of this universal law that males are promiscuous and females are chaste. And she has taken a forensic scalpel to Bateman's study, reproduced it herself, and gone back to his original notes and found that even his own data doesn't support his results, and that his results, he suffered from a case of confirmation bias. He skewed the results, and he collated them in a way which substantiated what he wanted to see rather than what was in front of his eyes. And Bateman's study is still on the syllabus at Oxford. It's not, and Patty's papers are not taught alongside it. When I spoke to a senior professor at Oxford to find out if Bateman's study was still taught as I was taught it in the late 1980s, and it is. Now, that's not the case in every university. Some places are more progressive, but that's worrying. Why are we still accepting these paradigms and expecting them to be true? It's so, that my book collects the research that's been done in this subject from the 1980s, from the early 1980s to now, and I mean, there's an entire book of it. There's huge amounts to discuss. But what shocks me is that some of the stuff that's it's just overturning these stereotypes is harder than it should be.
Yeah, there certainly seems to be a lot of inertia in the research. And I think one of the scientists you spoke to said that there's kind of a venerable tradition in British evolutionary biology to honor Darwin and sort of not question the basis that he laid down. I mean, that seems incredible, because Darwin certainly was not respecting of the wisdom of his time about how biology works.
Yeah, I mean, Darwin's a national treasure in the UK, so I think, I don't think it's any coincidence that many of the scientists that I interviewed come from America, although there are British scientists doing amazing work here. But I think as it was Joan Roughgarden actually who said that to me. She said that that she felt that we had a particularly conservative strain here in the UK, and I think she's probably right.
So in the book, you describe sex, as in the male and female categories and species, as anarchical. Does that mean that there aren't any sort of biological laws that the phenomena of sex follows? How kind of ungoverned is it?
Well, the first chapter is called "The Anarchy of Sex," because I was really surprised at when I came to understand how sexual differentiation actually happens, what we now understand. So, I did genetics all those many moons ago, and everybody at school learns that males are XY and females are XX. Let's just keep it simple and just talk about genetic sex determination with the XY system for the time being. So, males XY, females XX. And you sort of think that the genes that govern being male are on the Y chromosome, and the genes that govern being female are on the X, and that the pathways that take you to being male or female are linear and distinct. That's what I assumed, like many people. When I spoke to Jenny Graves, who's been studying sexual differentiation and determination for a very long time in everything from platypus to nematode worms, and she was part of the team that found the SRY gene, which is of course the trigger for the male pathway in humans. She's the one who told me that it's a pretty anarchic setup, and I was really amazed by what she told me, which is that. So when you have a fetus and it starts off as sexually neutral with a unisex kit of parts, and then there's a trigger in humans, the presence or absence of the SRY gene, that then triggers one of these two pathways. And then the gonads either become, start down the pathway of becoming a testes or an ovary. Now, what I didn't know, which Jenny told me, and she had to tell me 3 times because I couldn't believe it, is that the genes involved in making a testes or ovary are basically the same 60 genes. They just play to a different tune. And these 2 pathways involving these 60 genes are neither separate or linear. They're enmeshed and they work antagonistically. So in order to create an ovary, you have to suppress testes at the same time. And they now found in studies of mice that this suppression, this antagonistic relationship between these 2 pathways actually continues into adulthood. So, which suggests that the gonad is never actually stable in a mouse, which is an astonishing thing to discover. But what it also means is that, when she sent me this diagram to explain what these 2 linear pathways look like, and it was like a machine of millions of cogs and with these little blue balls being spat out and pumped between things and destroyed. And the whole thing was like a whirring mass. I mean, it was chaos. And she said that's what she sees these pathways to be like. And of course, that's the reason why we have, but because it's this, sort of anarchic system, that's why you get such an extraordinary variation, like the common garden mole, for example, which was recently, in a couple of years ago, had the genome decoded, because the common garden mole female has what's described as ovotestes, which are, her gonads are part ovarian tissue and part testicular tissue. And during the breeding season, her ovarian side produces eggs, and she, has pregnancy and gives birth, like as you'd expect. But outside of the breeding season, the testicular tissue swells and it produces testosterone. It doesn't produce sperm, but the testosterone makes her dig really hard and be really aggressive. So it also means that she has a vagina that seals shut, and her genitalia externally resemble a male. She has a clitoris that looks like a penis. So, she's pumped full of testosterone. She's got huge amounts of testicular tissue, and she morphologically, she looks externally like a male. Yet she is a female. So, and that sort of gonadal flexibility is the result of just 2 mutations of not even genes. I think they're genes, they're regulating factors. So it's an incredibly anarchic system involving these sort of androgynous genes, and I was really shocked by that.
Wow, yeah, that is incredible. Maybe we should back up a little bit and talk about where the sex differentiation itself might have come from, because organisms weren't always differentiated by sex. So why do evolutionary biologists think sex arose at all? What adaptive value is it thought to have?
Well, that's called the queen of questions, because sex doesn't make a lot of sense in evolutionary terms, because it's much more efficient for all organisms to produce eggs and not, I was listening to some Australian evolutionary biologist the other day who was talking about this all-female race of cricket, grasshoppers, that's currently marching across Australia, and he described males as evolutionary wastage, which I thought would make a fantastic T-shirt.
Yeah.
But yeah, so males in that sense are a waste, because you can be twice as productive if all individuals produce eggs, right? So the idea is that what sex does is it shakes up the genetic deck. So it creates variation, and it also eliminates the buildup of deleterious mutations. So that's thought of being the reason why we have sex. But then you have creatures like the Deloid rotifer that haven't had sex in 80 million years. and have somehow managed to continue to persist in the face of 80 million years of environmental change and parasites and whatever, and suddenly that theory becomes more shaky. But yeah, in theory, it's to shape and to mix the genetic deck and to get rid of harmful mutations. And exactly when it happened is up for debate. There's lots of different theories about that. I can't seem to find people agreeing about it. I talked to David Cruz, who's been studying this for a long time. He actually found the oldest transcription factor was estrogen, and that was around, like, I'm going to get the numbers wrong now because you've asked me a question about requiring me to remember specific numbers, but I think it was, he said 750 million years ago, but we need to check on that. And that the testosterone transcription factor didn't arrive for another 300,000 years or whatever. I can't remember I can't remember the numbers on this, but anyway, the long and short of it is that by his thinking, the original organisms had to produce eggs, and so the original organisms were female, and that males came along later.
So the opposite of the Genesis story.
Exactly. So God created woman in her own image.
Speaking of numbers, I think you mentioned that on average, there was some estimate that on average, asexual species die out after 100,000 years or something because of this supposed disadvantage in not being able to mix up the genetic deck?
Yeah, they're meant to have a shelf life of about 100,000 generations.
But then there are these wild exceptions.
And there's fantastic exceptions. The Delaware rotifer is the most extraordinary of all, but there are others who have been around that have gone beyond their shelf life. I've just seen how David Cruz puts the origin of sex. He puts the origin of sex sometimes 600 to 1.2 billion years ago.
Okay, so then life was without sex for like around 3 billion years.
Yeah, exactly. Right? Doing just fine, apparently.
That's crazy.
Yeah, I know. I think we've still got some stuff to figure out.
Yeah, no doubt. So we talked about chromosomal sex, and there are lots of different kinds of sex or ways you could pinpoint what distinguishes the sexes, right? So there's gonadal sex, where there's ovaries and testes, and you said there's a lot of blurred lines there with the mole. And then there's brain sex, right? What are some of the different types of sex that researchers have identified?
Well, biological sex is the standard definition, and that's what the gonads do. Whether they produce eggs or sperm denotes whether you're male or female. And my book, when I'm talking about, because animals don't have gender, so animals don't, gender is a psychological and social construct, and it's the preserve of humans. So in the book, when I'm talking about females, I'm talking about females of biological sex. They're egg making as opposed to sperm making. But even that definition is problematic, really, when you see creatures like, so with the mole, she's still producing eggs, so she's got gonadal fluidity there. But you'll find creatures like common garden frogs, which have they have genetic sex determination, but then that genetic sex determination can be overridden by an environmental sex determination. So there are plenty of animals, reptiles, and amphibians that have environmental sex determination. Famously, turtles, of course, they are, if they're incubated over a certain temperature, then they become female. Under that temperature, they become male. So frogs, it looks like they also have some sort of environmental trigger. not sure what it is, but it can override the genetic trigger. So then you end up with XX males and XY females, and their gonads are a mishmash. They're, so even with sort of gonadal sex, it's deciding which of two binary buckets a creature fits into can be really problematic. It's not easy, as Darwin discovered with the barnacles that he was so fond of. They have this whole sort of spectrum of sexual expression that you can see, where with every sort of in between from hermaphrodite through to separate sexes. And even today, the barnacle researchers struggle with how they describe the sex of their study subjects. But it's like I'm not able. I don't know the terms off the top of my head, but it's not simple to just say male or female, even when talking about gonads. But of course, other but that's the standard biological. How one defines sex is through the gonads.
It's kind of funny too how he talked about the barnacles finding mates, because barnacles don't move. So how are they able to find mates?
Well, you're right. If you're a barnacle and you're cemented to a rock with your head, which is what barnacles are, they're crustaceans. Everybody thought before Darwin came along, one of his big contributions to the field was that he realized that barnacles were crustaceans and not mollusks. Everybody thought they were mollusks before, but they're crustaceans. So they're like crabs and lobsters, but they've eschewed their mobility for home security. That's what they're really big on, barnacles. So the juveniles will attach themselves to a rock by their head. They're cemented to the rock, form the calcified plates. Bingo for home security. Less good for finding a mate. But thankfully, evolution has furnished the male barnacle with an extravagantly long penis, which means that it's several times longer than his body, and basically he can cruise the neighborhood for sex without ever having to move, and inseminate whoever he comes across, and also make the best of a situation where if he can't find anyone to fertilize, he can just come home and fertilize himself. The barnacles have really got all the bases covered on account of their desire to feel safe and secure.
That is crazy. Yeah, so a lot of the book is about the amusing but also just fascinating ways that the sex organs of so many different species have evolved to adapt to the scenario of how they're finding mates. I think there was you spent a good amount of time talking about dolphins and the way the female sexual anatomy has adapted to the mating strategies of the males. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, this is a fact. So this is new research. This is Patricia Brennan, who operates out of Mount Holyoke College. I'm going to pronounce it wrong, probably, in Massachusetts. And Patricia is really the first person to study vaginas. Penises have been studied for a very long time because there's extraordinary diversity out there. Animal penises can have spines, bones, corkscrews, they can be roving, lengthy objects like the barnacles. I mean, there's all sorts of diversity. And in fact, so much diversity that taxonomists even use genitalia as a means of telling apart species that are otherwise identical, like certain beetle species can only be told apart by looking at their genitals. And so there's been a huge fascination in penises in science in zoology for a long time. Less so for vaginas. Now you could say, oh, it's inside, it's harder to examine. But, the reality is that female genitalia was thought of like females were thought of, as being just passive, a passive receptacle for the male. But Patricia Brennan, has thought otherwise and has studied them. In particular, she paid attention to the genitalia of ducks. Now, male ducks are famous for having, like the barnacle, a ridiculously long penis. The Argentine lake duck, I think it's even longer than its body, and on top of that, it's a corkscrew. So it's a bit, and you might think to yourself, well, I've never seen that on a duck. Well, it's most of the time it's kind of kept inside the cloaca. So ducks, all birds have cloacas, and in the case of ducks, they also have this penis sort of inside the cloaca that is filled with lymphatic fluid and can explode out of the cloaca at something like 75 miles an hour, like a sort of sinewy party hoot. There's those party hooter things you get, right? It sort of shoots out. And,
wow.
This extraordinary organ has caused a bit of a stir. And so there's been lots of theories as to why duck penises would be so long and corkscrew. And it turned, the idea was that it was, good old sexual selection. It was male competition. Duck sex, unfortunately, young males that don't find a partner gang up together, and they can be sexually coercive on females. It's a really horrible thing if you've seen it. And so the idea was that the males, the longer the penis, the male that wins the fight, right, gets closer to the sperm, and so that was the driving force of the male penis length. Well, Patricia Brennan was the first person to go, well, I wonder what kind of garage he's parking his car in. And she looked inside the female duck, which the textbooks would tell you is just a simple tube. And she found anything but a simple tube. She found just as extravagant an organ. Interestingly, just like the duck penis, it fluctuates according to season. So during the breeding season, the male penis becomes longer and more extravagant, as does the female's vagina. So if you did look outside of the breeding season, you would find a more simple affair in a female duck. But anyway, so she found that the female vagina had blind pouches, but more importantly, it corkscrewed in the opposite direction. So what she realized is that it's basically, it prevents coercive males from fertilizing her, because a female vagina of a duck can open wide in order to lay an egg. The lumen can expand in order to lay an egg. So she theorizes that the female, if she chooses her partner in an elaborate dance and he's the one that she wants to fertilize her egg, then she'll open up the lumen of her vagina and his weird curly whirly penis will go all the way through. But if she's not interested, then her vagina remains tight, and with all these blind pouches and then this corkscrew the opposite way, the male's penis sort of often unfurls back on itself and doesn't fertilize the eggs. And that supports the data, which was always anomalous before, which was that, in terms of when you do paternity, very few of these coercive acts ever result in chicks. So what was fascinating about that is that it's the female that's driving the evolution of the extraordinary male penis. And Patricia Brennan also rescues the female from being a victim in all of this, because she's the one, she's retaining her autonomy. She's choosing who fathers her egg. And so although she's still subject to coercive acts, which, doesn't particularly, when viewed by humans, seems pretty horrifying. But as far as evolution is concerned, she's the winner because she's retaining the choice of who fertilizes those eggs. So, and that was all from just studying the vagina of a duck, which is amazing. And then she moved on to dolphins. She found the same thing with dolphins. Dolphins also famously coercive, but she found the same convoluted vagina, and she thinks it's the same deal there.
And you also talk about a lot of species where sex isn't so coercive, where it's more cooperative and can even be used as kind of a social glue, or kind of the cool down tensions. What are some of the species that use sex in this way that seems not to be about procreation, but just getting along better.
Yeah, so this is another sort of, just real sort of Victorian idea that sex is just for reproduction. And so if sex is just for reproduction, then same-sex sexual activity becomes really anomalous, because it's like, well, that's a waste of energy, isn't it? I mean, if they're, why would that happen? But yet same-sex sexual activity is widespread throughout the animal kingdom. I mean, Bruce Bagmill documented over 300 species where same-sex sexual activity has been observed. But in particular, the bonobos, who are our closest relative alongside chimpanzees, the females have sex with each other. And they do so in a very particular way. It's called GG rubbing. And their clitoris is actually migrated so that it's in a position where it gets most stimulation from this particular kind of sex. So the females have sex with each other, and Amy Parish, who studied female bonobos, told me that if a female and a male present themselves to a female bonobo, she more often than not, she'll choose to have sex with the female rather than the male. Well, the reason why this sex is so prevalent is because it serves a function, and which is that it bonds the females. So female bonobos are like chimpanzees. They don't form a stable heritable matriline in groups. They are the sex that disperses from their natal group. So when females are together in troops, they are unrelated females. So you'd expect them to be competitive with one another, but actually they're not competitive with each other, and they have this incredibly strong sisterhood, which is forged and maintained by sexual activity with each other, which basically dampens aggression. It bonds them. So and as a result of that, those bonds, the females are actually the dominant sex. Male bonobos are like chimpanzees. They're bigger than females, but yet they are not the physically dominant sex. They're physically dominant, but they're not the dominant sex. The females are eat first, whereas female chimpanzees don't. And females are considered to be in most situations in the wild, and all situations in captivity, females are dominant. So the female bonobo have basically overthrown the patriarchy through ecstatic same-sex, which is one way of doing it. So sex serves lots of functions. It's not just for reproduction.
What is the reason for sexual dimorphism in different species? Why does it play out in different ways? Why is one sex sometimes bigger than the other, or more aggressive, or like what are the forces that determine how that works in different species?
Well, it's so, Darwin would have said that the sort of the zoological law would have said that those dimorphisms are dictated by our sex cells. Females produce small amount of energy expensive eggs, and so we are destined to be choosy and chase and passive, whereas males produce lots of mobile sperm, and so they're destined to be active and big and aggressive and dominant. But actually, what we now understand is that sex isn't a crystal ball. Whether you produce eggs or sperm, it doesn't dictate what kind of dimorphisms exist, if any. It's the environment that you find yourself in that does. It's the combination of environmental factors, shared genes, and a bit of serendipity. There's also an element, considerable element of chance in all of this that shape sexes to be either, the same or different, or but it's not simply that you can equate males are going to be bigger and more aggressive because they produce sperm, and females are going to be small and passive because they produce eggs. It's just nonsense.
Right. So, for example, in spiders, female spiders are much bigger and more violent, and even eat the males after the males mate with them, right? It's,
Yeah, they'll eat the males before they've had sex with them in some occasions. So don't
yeah.
want to ruin your morning, Brian. But they females. So I mean, it makes sense for the female to be bigger, right? Because she's got a lot of it. She's bigger. She can make more eggs, right? So in the case of spiders, females can be way bigger, like 125 times bigger than the male, which is astonishing, really. I mean, I didn't realize this until I was researching this book, but the female spiders are if you see a spider in a web, it's more than likely it's going to be a female, because females generally are the ones that build the webs. They're bigger than the males. Sometimes the males, they only live the females live much longer. The males live for a fraction of a time. They're a fraction of the size. Sometimes they don't have fangs or even venom. They're just sort of walking sacks of sperm, really. And so, and they also, and also to cap it all, they look like lunch, so, and they have to do this sort of, I mean, I found this just fascinating. I really, really enjoyed researching and writing about the spiders, because it's just so amazing, isn't it, to try and sort of imagine that world, because a spider, they although they've got 8 eyes, they don't actually see very well. Their main sense is vibration, so that's how they detect almost everything. So if you're a male spider, you need to you want to get the attention of your mate. She can't hear, she can't necessarily see you, so you've got to make vibration, and the best way to get her attention is to make like dinner, and sort of like shake the web and be like, whoa, she'll be like, whoa, dinner, because animals with small brains, they have limited sensory realm, and so that these sort of what was fascinating to discover is that so many courtship routines are based around things that are a bit like food. So, like with bowerbirds, for example, the ones that decorate their bower with blue bling, well, that's because there's a blue fruit, that's much prized, So anyway, spiders, the male has to choose, he has to sort of, make like dinner in order to get noticed. But of course, because the worst thing that can happen is that he doesn't mate at all. That is the worst thing to happen. He might get eaten before, if she's hungry and he's played it badly, he's played a bad game, he might get eaten before sex. But even if he gets eaten just like sort of like during sex, which often happens, they can be incredibly fast with their pedipalps. I mean, I spoke to this man who's got this sort of slightly unenviable job of trying to breed rare spiders. This lovely man called Dave Clark at Zoological Society of London. And he's got this sort of the Fenraff spider, which is an endangered British species, and it's his job to try and propagate the species. So, when he has these, these sort of, he's trying to mate individuals, he's got added stress from the fact that these are highly endangered, and that the female may go and eat the male, and boom, like how's that going to help? But anyway, he found that on one occasion the female ate the male, and he was amazed. He thought, oh, that's it, and he felt terrible, and he thought he introduced the male at the wrong time, and he got it all wrong. But actually, in a split second, he'd managed to insert his pedipalp and fertilize the female. So everyone's a winner. Not only has the male managed to fertilize the female, but by eating his body, she's also going to nourish those eggs and spiderlings, and they've got a better chance of survival. So I mean, it seems brutal to us, but it works. It does make evolutionary sense for males to get eaten. There's Eileen Hebberts, who studies in Nebraska. She does some amazing work on spiders, and she's found that there is something particular about eating another member of your own species that's particularly nourishing for the female. So she did this experiment where she fed females the equivalent weight in fly to the weight of the male, and the females that cannibalized their own species, they grew much bigger and they did much better. So she came to the conclusion there's something sort of uniquely nutritious about eating your own species.
It does sound advantageous. And yeah, the plight of the male spider just really hammers home the point that evolution optimizes, among other things, but mostly for reproducing, not surviving. So as you know, as long as the male gets to reproduce, then it doesn't matter if he survives.
Exactly. And I mean, life's not great for the female spider either, because matrophagy is a thing with spiders. So the mother herself may end up being consumed by her spiderlings, slowly eaten abdomen first. So, it's not
Wow.
great for either of them, really.
Yeah, so to go back to the chimps and the bonobos, you talked about how the primatologists who study those groups sort of see them as informing kind of human possibility of ways we can live together, because they're both very closely related to us, right? They're our nearest primate ancestors, and yet they live such different lives, males and females. Do we understand what might have caused them to take such different trajectories in the way they relate to each other?
It'll be the environment. That's what it is. So the bonobos, chimpanzees are much more widely distributed in Africa than bonobos. Bonobos are only found on one side of the Congo River in a fairly small area. But it's I believe there's a much more abundant there's more abundant fruit where they live. So no doubt it will be the environment that has shaped their particular society and is responsible for them evolving, and along with chance, it will be another factor. So but it is interesting that they are so radically different, because male chimpanzees are patriarchal and warlike, and bonobos, equally closely related to us, are matriarchal and peaceful. And until the bonobo came along, the chimpanzee was the model for our ancestry, as our closest relative. And then the bonobo came along, and suddenly, could that be a model for our ancestry? Well, that's the kind of thing that anthropologists will argue about forever, and they can do that. But I think what's interesting about that story is that it shows the flexibility of dominance, number one. So it's not dictated by whether you produce eggs or sperm. It's not, patriarchy isn't burnt into our primate DNA. It's flexible. It also shows the power of the sisterhood. Now, I'm not suggesting that we all have sex with each other, but getting along with your forming alliances with females is clearly a good thing if you want to sort of have to gain power. And it also shows the flexibility of sexuality, because Amy Parish and Franz de Waal both say that all bonobos are essentially, they're bisexual. So they're quite happy to have sex with their own sex or the opposite sex. It doesn't really matter. So for those reasons, I think it's really interesting, and you can draw what you like from that. But it's certainly, I think it's the bonobos are a welcome addition to the great ape scene.
So we're coming up in an hour here, and I don't want to hold you for too much longer. But I guess as a closing question, what do you think all of this wealth of information about how diverse and flexible sex really is in the animal kingdom can kind of influence how we think about the topic, and how the topic of sex kind of fuels a lot of cultural conversations? What do you think is the insight and the lesson for people who are just learning all this fascinating new research about sex?
Well, I think, what I would hope is that, people who read my book will understand, like I said, that biological sex isn't a crystal ball. You can't Females are not meant to behave in a certain way because they produce eggs, and males are meant to behave in a certain way because they produce sperm. And that, the variety that we see in nature of both the expression of sex and also the sort of spectrum of sex itself, I think should it sort of inspire us to see the sort of limitless possibilities of the female experience, and not feel boxed in by stereotypes.
All right, Lucy Cooke, do you want to tell our viewers where they can find you online? Do you have social media accounts or a website they can check out to learn more about your work?
I do, and I should probably have them more at my fingertips. I do Twitter. I'm MS Lucy Cooke, LucyCooke on Twitter, and I do Instagram as well. And I think I'm Lucky Cookie on there, just to confuse everybody. So yeah, Twitter or Twitter Ms Lucy Cooke with an E, and Instagram Lucky Cookie.
All right.
Or Lucky Cook.
Once again,
it might be Lucky Cook or Lucky Cookie, but you'll see me. They'll find me.
Oh, well. The book is "Bitch on the Female of the Species." Lucy, thanks so much for talking to us.
Thank you. Great questions, Brian. Really fun. I loved it.
Thank you. Thank you.